Welcome to the session on operations management. In the last class, we are discussing on aggregate planning. We discussed on what is meant by aggregate planning, what is the use of aggregate planning, what are the strategies that we follow for aggregate planning, the strategies which were followed in aggregate planning. Okay, to meet the demand, and we came to know that aggregate planning, in the aggregate planning, the planning of the activities were made for a duration of 2 to 18 months, and we discussed what are the strategies followed for aggregate planning, and then we discussed on what is the purpose of aggregate planning and what is the scope of aggregate planning in any management system. It may be service oriented or it may be manufacturing oriented. Whatever may be the type of organization, the operations man, the aggregate planning, what is the requirement, what is the purpose, what is the scope of aggregate planning, what is meant by aggregate planning, what are the strategies that were followed in aggregate planning. These are the topics which we discussed in the last class. Today we are discussing on the technique used for aggregate planning. That means the methods which are followed in aggregate planning to take proper decisions so that the demands, so that the activities can be performed without any interruption in the coming period. Means aggregate planning is applicable for 6 to 18 months. It plans the activities so that the demand can be met. Okay, then what are the techniques which are followed in aggregate planning? Numerous techniques help decision makers with the task of aggregate planning. In the aggregate planning, the decision makers follow different types of techniques. All these techniques which are followed by the decision makers mainly fall into two categories. The first one is informal trial and error techniques. The second one is the mathematical techniques. In informal or trial and error techniques, the decision makers make use of their experience, where the decisions were taken based on the judgment, based on the strategies. But in mathematical techniques, they make use of some methods. They make use of some formulate. They are going to formulate the things. They are going to arrange the things. In practice, the informal techniques are more frequently used. Compared to the mathematical techniques, the informal techniques, strategies. We discussed 3 different strategies: varying the workforce, varying the making use of inventory or OT. These are the most commonly used techniques in aggregate planning. However, a considerable amount of research has been devoted to mathematical techniques also. In recent years, they, along with the strategies, along with the judgment and opinion, the decision makers also making use of the mathematical techniques. In the recent years, some diversion is made. In the recent years, they are widely used. They are not widely used earlier. Now they are using the mathematical models. Even though they are not widely used, they serve as the basis for comparing the effectiveness of the alternative techniques. They are not widely used, they are not implemented, but they serve as a basis when comparing the different alternatives in aggregate planning. Thus, it will be instructive to briefly examine them as well as the informal techniques also. Then what is the general procedure which was followed in the aggregate planning? The first step is to determine the demand. What should be the demand for the next period? What is the demand? It may be for next 18 months, next 2 months, next 6 months, whatever it may be. The first step in the aggregate planning is to determine what is the demand for each period. It may be in terms of quarters, it may be in terms of months, it may be in terms of weeks. It depends on the product. First, we need to determine what is the demand for each period. Once the demand is determined, the next step is to determine the capacities. What is the capacity of the plant? What is the total amount of products that we can manufacture? What is the maximum service that we can offer if it is a service organization, including regular time, overtime and subcontracting also. We need to determine the second step is, first step is to determine the demand. The second step is to determine the capacity of the organization. The next step is identify the company or the department policies that are pertinent. That means whether we are giving the subcontracting, whether we are maintaining the inventory to reach the demand. We need to identify, we must know, the decision maker must know what are the policies followed by the company or the department in each department. Okay, for example, maintain a safety stock of 5% of demand. Maintain a reasonably stable workforce. Means what is the policy followed by the department, whether they are for maintaining the inventory or whether they are maintaining the stable workforce or whether they are varying the workforce. The decision maker must know the policies of the organization. Then only he can take proper decisions. Next, once he came to know the policies, he must determine what is the costs that were incurred, that were involved in the production of the product. It may be in the regular time, it may be in the overtime, it may be in the subcontracting, it may be holding the inventories. He must know the costs involved in each case, because already we discussed the 3 different strategies and we need to compare all these 3 strategies, which one is the best. To determine, you must know the cost involved in each parameter, in each category. Then only you can make proper decisions. The next one is, once he came to know the policies, once he came to know the costs, he has to develop alternatives and he has to compute the cost. He has to find the cost in each alternative and he has to compare those alternatives. If the satisfactory plans were emerged, select any one. If satisfactory plans were not emerged, then follow the above 5 procedures again. Repeat the procedure until we get a satisfactory plan. Okay, this is about the techniques of aggregate planning. Then what is an informal technique use? Informal approaches consists of developing simple tables or the graphs that enable planners to visually compare projected demand requirements with the existing capacity. Here some simple tables were developed in the informal technique use based on judgment, based on the experience, graphs are developed which helps the decision makers to compare the demand with capacities. Alternatives are usually evaluated in terms of their overall costs. I already said the different strategies were followed in the informal techniques. Based on different strategies, different demand requirements, different capacities we will get, and based on this some tables, some graphs are developed, and these alternatives are evaluated in terms of cost. Okay, the chief disadvantage of such technique is that they do not necessarily result in optimal aggregate planning. Also they given some decisions. It is not optimal. Optimal means it is not the fine, it is not the good aggregate planning. Very often graphs can be used to guide the development of alternatives. Some decision makers follow cumulative graphs and some may follow period by period breakdown of the plan. Cumulative means added. First month, second month, everything is added and they generate graphs. Some planners may use period by period breakdown. Means for each period they are not going to add, they are going to draw the graph separately. Okay, this is about informal technique use. They observe different strategies. Based on different strategies, different demands, you will get different graphs we will obtain. Based on the graphs, you are going to evaluate the alternatives, and which is the best alternative, you are going to follow that alternative. Okay, but it doesn't yields in an optimal aggregate planning, the best aggregate planning. But this is the most commonly used technique which was followed in the management system. It may be service organization, it may be manufacturing organization. Then the second method, we already said, mathematical approaches to aggregate planning. In mathematical approaches, we are having different methods. The first one is linear programming. Linear programming is an optimization technique that allows the user to find a maximum profit or the revenue or a minimum cost based on the availability of limited resources and the certain limitation known as constants. In linear programming, it is an optimization, it is a fine technique which gives better results, which allows the users to find what is the maximum profit that we can get and what is the minimum cost that we can get. By using this technique, the decision makers can easily find out what is the maximum profit and what is the minimum cost based on the availability of limited resources. Each organization is having its own limits. Based on those limits, by following the linear programming, a decision maker can easily find out what is the maximum profit in each alternatives, in each method. Okay, a special type of linear programming known as the transportation model can be used to obtain the aggregate planning. Transportation, we will discuss that later in detail. It is one of the techniques, it is one of the linear programming techniques which is most commonly used in aggregate planning. Okay. For aggregate, the next method is mixed integer programming. For aggregate plans that are prepared on a product family basis, means where the plan is essentially the summation of the plans for individual product lines. Means in a single industry, if the different products are manufactured and the aggregate plan is to be made for the different products, in such a case the aggregate plan is the summation of different plans where the plans are different for each individual product. In such cases, we make use of mixed integer programming. It provides a method. The mixed integer programming provides a method for determining the number of units to be produced in each product. It provides a method of determining the number of units. It determines, by following this method, the decision maker can easily determine what is the number of products to be manufactured the number of units to be manufactured in a family of products. Okay, the next one is linear decision rule. It is an optimizing technique. It seeks to minimize total production cost. It may be labor, it may be overtime, it may be hiring, using a set of cost approximation functions to obtain a simple quadratic equation. Okay, it is a linear decision rule. It is an optimizing technique which minimizes the total production cost, where the cost approximating functions means are used. Cost approximating functions means the costs, the variables are used to obtain, to develop a quadratic equations. Means the dependent variable and independent variables, the costs involved, cost approximating functions are evaluated and a quadratic equation is developed. Then by using calculus, two linear equations are derived from that quadratic equation. One to be used to plan the output in out of two linear equations. One is used for plan the output for each period, and the other equation is used for planning the workforce for each period. Okay, linear decision rule. It is an optimizing technique where the cost approximating functions are used to obtain a single quadratic equation. Then by using calculus, by using mathematical techniques, this quadratic equation is converted, using this quadratic equation, two linear equations are derived. One linear equation is used to calculate the output of the what is the workforce required, and one more equation is used to plan the activities. Okay, next method in mathematical technique is management coefficients model. It is formulated by E.H. Bowman. It suggests that the production rate in any organization can be calculated by using a formula. P suffix t equals A into W suffix t minus 1 minus B into L suffix t minus 1 plus C into F suffix t plus 1 plus K, where A, B, C are the constants. P suffix t is nothing but the production rate. W suffix t minus 1 is the workforce of the organization in the previous period. L suffix t minus 1 is the inventory which was there in the organization for the previous period. F suffix t minus 1 is the forecast of the demand for the next period. The management coefficient model is developed by Bowman, and he suggests that the production rate in any organization depends on a general rule, and he gives equation for that. Based on this equation, we can calculate the production rate for a specific period, considering the workforce of the previous period, inventory of the previous period, and forecasted demand for the next period. Okay, means current period. Then it makes use of regression analysis. We discussed already the regression analysis in the third module, in the second module, in the forecasting chapter. It makes use of that linear equation, and then it makes use of regression analysis to estimate, to determine the constants A, B, C and K. The end result is a decision rule based on past managerial behavior. then the decision was taken based on the managerial behavior without any explicit cost functions. The assumption in this method is the manager know what is important. That is the basic assumption in management coefficient model. And even if they cannot readily state the explicit cost. Okay, this is all about the techniques which are used in aggregate planning. In the next class, we are going to discuss on the problems of aggregate planning. That's all for today. Thank you.